All earth belongs to the Holy One. Blessed be he. He created it and gave it to whom it seemed proper in his eyes. When he willed it, he gave it to them, and when he willed, he took it from them and gave it to us. O my people, enter the Holy Land which Allah has assigned to you, and do not turn back from fighting in Allah's cause, and thus become losers. As Jesus drew near Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, If this day you only knew what makes for peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days are coming upon you when your enemies will raise a palisade against you. They will encircle you and hem you on all sides. Jerusalem, the Holy Land, Israel. It means something to all three Abrahamic faiths. It is a place so connected to God that it has sent men mad trying to hold it. From the ancient times to the modern times, war has ravaged the land and its people. I won't tell you who deserves it more, who has better claim, whether one cause fought for a slight against somebody who is not alive to be offended is better than another. That is not my place. My place is to talk about history. It is to explain what happened, when it happened, and why. For better or for worse, depending on who you are, Israel is a country. It exists as a people. The Palestinians exist as a people, the Palestinian Muslims, and the Palestinian Christians. So let's get the disclaimers out of the way first, because good lord, this is going to upset people no matter which way I slice it. The current conflict started in a horrific way, through horrific actions against innocent civilians, and it will end in a bloody mess. I won't dress this up. It is going to end in a biblical fashion that I don't think a lot of people understand or are ready to understand. This will not be pretty. This will not make you comfortable. It will make you sick. There will be no glory at the end, no great victory. It is going to be awful. There is going to be blood. And as I've said, I don't think a lot of people are ready for it. I've said this before in private, and my mods have said this as well on the Discord. This is not a case of Israel being stuck with the Arabic nations around it and trapped. No, the Middle East is trapped with Israel, and the leash is likely to be completely gone now. I genuinely believe that there will be no stopping what actually comes next. That being said, this is not a video supporting Israel. This is not a video supporting the Arabic nations. This is a war. It happened. This is what happened. Not what I think happened. It is what actually happened. And I am probably not going to look at the comments here, and I'm acutely aware there's going to be some severely annoyed comments, but as I say, history is not black and white. It is grey. And if you're always feeling comfortable watching and reading about history, you are doing it wrong. And with that said, anti-Semitism and anti-Islamic and hateful rhetoric is not welcome in my comments, and not welcome on my Discord, and not welcome in my channel. Before we really get into it, I will not be discussing USS Liberty. That ship was attacked. There are reasons why have been reported differently depending on your perspective and sources, but examining this specific incident will result likely in a lot of particularly violent comments. This is not something I will entertain, nor will I entertain conspiracy. Also, it's not going to have an effect on the outcome of the war. It had no effect whatsoever. You know it's a good topic when there's a solid 2 minutes of disclaimers, don't you? Actually, it's about 4 minutes now looking at the recording, so well, let's get into it. The 6-Day War. Either way you slice it up, the 6-Day War changed the face of the Middle East. It was an incredible victory for Israel. In only 6 days, they managed to overwhelm and defeat the combined forces of the leaders of the Arab world, maintain the sovereignty, and enlarge the Israeli state. The military campaign during this war was honestly incredible, and it warrants a closer look. The conflict itself is often seen as one of just the many Israeli-Arabic flare-ups, and in many ways this view is correct. However, following the introduction of the State of Israel post the Second World War, and the subsequent war that followed, the 6-Day War is really the first time where Israel is cemented in its position as a nation and as a state. And following the Suez Crisis in 1956, when Egypt agreed to the stationing of United Nations emergency forces on the Sinai to ensure all parties would comply with those 1949 peace accords, you really do start to see Israel's position was tenuous at best. Now, that force that was positioned in 1956 was completely ineffective in stopping border clashes from growing intensity between the Israelis and the Arabs, and in early November 1966, Syria signed a mutual defense agreement with Egypt. Israel was now theoretically facing a two-front war. Soon after this, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, increased their guerrilla activity, and the Israeli Defense Force, IDF, attacked the village of Asamu in the West Bank, which was occupied by Jordan. Jordanian units engaged with the Israelis but were quickly beaten back. Now, King Hussein of Jordan criticized the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser for failing to come to Jordan's aid and accused him of hiding behind UNEF's skirts. Israel was now effectively surrounded with 3 hostile powers on each of its flanks. So essentially, I've just bridged over the first 20 years of Israel's existence. Flashing forward to 1967, Nasser received false reports from the Soviet Union that Israel was massing on the Syrian border. Keep in mind, the Arab nations were very much acting as a Soviet-influenced part of the scale in the region, whereas the US was backing Israel. On the 16th of May, Nasser began massing his troops in 2 defensive lines within the Sinai Peninsula, and he expelled the UNEF forces from Gaza and Sinai on the 19th of May. Israel repeated declarations it had made in 1957 that any closure of the Straits of Tiran would be considered an act of war or justification of. Likely thinking this was a bluff, now this is my personal opinion here, I believe Nasser thought that this was a pure bluff. I don't think he thought Israel would actually go to war over this. Nasser closed the straits to Israeli shipping on the 22nd and 23rd of May. US President Lyndon B. Johnson would say after the fact, if a single act of folly was more responsible for this explosion than any other, it was the arbitrary and dangerous announced decision that the Straits of Tiran would be closed. The right of innocent maritime passage must be preserved for all nations. On the 30th of May, the Arabic coalition made it official, with Jordan and Egypt signing a defensive pact, with Iraqi forces entering Jordan and taking up positions, later being reinforced by the Egyptians. In response, on the 1st of June, Israel formed a national unity government by widening its cabinet. With the straits closed and forces en masse against them, the decision was made to launch Operation Focus. Israel would decide of the fate of the coming conflict within a matter of hours through overwhelming air superiority and air power. This war takes place over a really short period of time on 3 major fronts, so I'm going to cover them in order of precedence as effectively where the most happened and as fast as it happened. So we're going to cover the Sinai, then we're going to jump back and we're going to cover the West Bank, and then we're going to jump back again and we're going to cover the Golan Heights. So first, the Sinai. At 7:45 AM Israeli time on the 5th of June, civil defense sirens screamed into life across Israel. With just under 200 operational jet aircraft striking Egyptian airfields in a surprise attack. When I say just under 200 operational jet aircraft, this was every single aircraft Israel basically had. They had prepared for this though, by training to refit their aircraft as fast as possible, and were able to launch 4 sorties in a day to the Egyptian 2. This training and the preparedness to do these kinds of rapid round-the-clock rearming, strike, rearm, strike kind of attacks has led to conspiracy theorists believing American, British, and also possibly French aircraft took part in the war. But this is simply not the case. None of Egypt's airfields were prepared for the firepower unleashed by Operation Focus. There were no hardened aircraft shelters capable of protecting their planes. With a lack of radar, the Israeli jets would fly out over the Mediterranean Sea, flying as low as possible, and then they would turn inland and strike over and over again. Egyptian paranoia against rebel forces also hindered their defense, with the entire air defense grid shut down to protect Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir and Lieutenant General Sadiq Mahmoud's flights. However, the Israeli attacks came in so low, not exactly likely this would have made a huge difference. For example, they were flying so low the SA-2SAMs could not even bring down the aircraft if they tried. Israel shredded the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, but more crucially, Israel's aircraft tore apart the runways. Unable to take off, unable to fight, within 12 hours, the Egyptian Air Force was rendered a moot point. 338 aircraft were destroyed and 100 pilots were killed. The destruction dished out that day was so severe that Western media was convinced it was pure Israeli propaganda and not the reality on the ground. Egypt would scramble to claim that it had destroyed 70 Israeli planes in what was now being considered a great victory. That will come back to bite the Arab League very, very heavily, but we'll get into that. 5 minutes after the aircraft took off, the northern division of the 70,000 men Israel had on the border with Egypt crossed and advanced with armor, advancing swiftly and initially being met with light resistance. Egyptian intelligence was convinced that this was a diversion, as previously when Israeli forces moved into the Sinai, they took the middle paths essentially across the Sinai. There are a limited amount of avenues you can attack the Sinai from due to the terrain. Historically, Israel used the middle one, so Egypt thought they were going to use the middle one again. This was not the case. As the lead Israeli battalion advanced, it suddenly came under intense fire and took significant losses. A second battalion was brought up, but it was also pinned down. Meanwhile, the 60th Brigade became bogged down in the sand, while the paratroopers that Israel was launching ahead had trouble navigating through the dunes. Israel would continue to press forward, disregarding losses, clearing Egyptian positions, and reaching a railway junction ahead in just about 4 hours. The advance would continue in much of the same fashion over the next few days, with Egyptian forces desperately trying to fight a holding action in the face of an unrelenting advance, while the remnants of the Egyptian Air Force attempted to take off and attack the Israelis on the ground, but were just completely overwhelmed by Israeli air power. Coming in from the north, breaking the Egyptian line, and then attacking from the south, Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir heard about the fall of the city of Abu Agela on the 6th of June, and he panicked. He ordered all units in the Sinai to retreat. All 100,000 men, at pre-war levels, were ordered to retreat. This order effectively meant the defeat of Egypt, with President Nasser having learned of the results of the Israeli airstrikes, himself ordering a general retreat from the Sinai within 24 hours. No detailed instructions were given, though, to any of the men in how they were meant to do this retreat, and how they were meant to withdraw to Suez. And this is reflected in the fact that Israeli forces were able to move ahead of the Egyptians and block and hold the Gidi Pass, leading to the case of Egyptian forces retreating straight into the Israeli front line. Due to the speed of the Egyptian retreat, soldiers often abandoned weapons, military equipment, and hundreds of vehicles. Many soldiers were cut off from their units and had to walk about 200 kilometers, or about 120 miles, on foot before reaching the Suez Canal, with limited supplies of food and water, and being exposed to intense heat the entire way. Thousands would die from exposure, with many Egyptian soldiers rather choosing to surrender than face this fate. Israel reached the point right now where they had so many prisoners, they started directing the Egyptians towards the Suez themselves because they could not take more prisoners, and they were only taking the high-ranking officers who they wanted to exchange for shot-down pilots. Now, according to some accounts, note I say some, and take this with a grain of salt, and the Russian archives are shut, so I can't exactly check them. Allegedly, a unit of Soviet Marines at Port Said came ashore and attempted to move east, but were immediately decimated when an Israeli airstrike was called on them, with the lieutenant colonel wounded. By the 8th of June, it was all over in the Sinai. Egyptian forces were broken and in complete disarray. The lack of coordination following the opening airstrikes were the determinant factor in Israel's victory. Let's scale it back a bit to the start of the war, and let's head back to the West Bank. King Hussein of Jordan had placed control of the Jordanian army under Egyptian command on the 1st of June, under the general Riyad. Confused at the rapid strike from the Israeli Air Force on the 5th, and a message from Field Marshal Amir saying that the large radar formations were actually Egyptian aircraft on their way to attack Israel, General Riyad took no action for a crucial 2 hours on the 5th. At 9 AM finally, the order was given to attack. The Israelis had planned to remain defensive along the Jordanian front, with the Egyptians being seen as the greatest threat, with the Sinai front taking precedence. As the combined Egyptian-Jordanian force attacked, intermittent machine gun exchanges began taking place in the city of Jerusalem at 9:30 AM. These exchanges would grow in intensity as mortars and recoilless rifles were brought to bear, and under orders from General Narkis, the Israelis responded with only small arms fire. At 10 AM on the 5th, the Jordanians began shelling Israel, 2 batteries of 155mm long Tom cannons opening fire on Tel Aviv and Ramat David Air Base. Sometime around 10:30 AM, Israel had reached out to King Hussein, promising not to undertake military action against Jordan if it stayed out of the war, clearly an attempt to break the siege that Israel was now under. King Hussein replied in a matter-of-fact way saying it was too late, that the die was cast. At 11:15 AM, Jordanian howitzers began a 6,000 shell barrage at Israeli Jerusalem. Targets initially included Kibbutz Ramat Rachel in the south and Mount Scopus in the north. Then they ranged into the city centre and outlying neighbourhoods. Military installations, the Prime Minister's residence, and the Knesset compound were also targeted, and Jordanian forces shelled the Beit Hanassi and Biblical Zoo. At 11:50 AM, 16 Jordanian Hawker hunters attacked Netnya, Kfar Serkin, and Kfar Saba. 3 Iraqi Hawker hunters strafed civilian settlements in the Jezreel Valley, and an Iraqi Tupolev Tu-16 attacked Afula and was shot down near the Megiddo airfield. At 12:30 p.m, the Israeli air forces shifted their attention to Jordan and attacked the nation's 2 air bases in waves. The aforementioned Hawker hunters were on the ground refueling at the time. The first wave of Israeli planes destroyed the runways, and the second destroyed all 21 Jordanian Hawker hunters, for the loss of 1 aircraft to anti-air fire. With the war now official, Israeli planes breached Iraqi airspace, destroying 12 MiG-21s, 2 MiG-17s, 5 Hunter F-6s, and 3 IL-26 bombers. In response to the shelling by Jordan, Israel responded with a devastating missile barrage using the before then unknown El missile, which was secretly developed with France before the war. Jordanian fighters pressed hard into Jerusalem and were able to take key buildings, however all while being watched by UN observers who at this point just didn't do anything. They watched, I guess, they watched. My opinion of the UN is not exactly high, but they watched. Brutal hand-to-hand fighting was taking place, and the weight of fire by Israeli forces caused a retreat towards Bethlehem, the Jordanians having lost about 100 men during the incursion. The Israelis quickly launched a counter-invasion into Jordanian-held territory. The shining factor in Israeli success in what would become some of the most brutal fighting in the war was the ability for individual soldiers to act and fight with their own initiative, following the death of all but 2 Israeli officers. When I say brutal hand-to-hand fighting, I mean incredibly brutal. The combat, lasting for some time, ended with a Jordanian retreat. However, the pinpoint sniper fire from the Jordanians kept the Israelis stuck in place for some time. The Israeli forces crucially did not enter the old city initially due to the possibility of damage to holy sites and the risk of international condemnation, should they be damaged. But Israel's attack being successful and managing to take control of the West Bank by the evening of 7th of June allowed for the conditions where that hesitation has passed, and the Israeli paratroopers took the old city of Jerusalem, with hand-to-hand fighting taking place on the Temple Mount. That same Temple Mount where hand-to-hand fighting took place when the Romans took Jerusalem. The same Temple Mount where hand-to-hand fighting took place when the Crusaders took Jerusalem. I'm talking a part of the city, although the physicality and the buildings had changed, you're seeing hand-to-hand combat of the brutalest kind in the modern era. Following bloody fighting in the urban streets, Jordanian forces retreated over the Jordan River, and Jordan was out. This just left Syria. To the north, the border between Israel and Syria is a place known as the Golan Heights. These heights, historically speaking, have been quite the obstacle for military action, with the Australian Light Horse being caught up here in a particularly bloody fight during the First World War as just one example. Knowing war was coming, and knowing how important the Golan Heights were, see, something about the Golan Heights a lot of people don't realise is the water supply for Israel is fed from tributaries in the Golan Heights. The Israeli intention was effectively to confine, as I said, the line of contact to the Egyptian front, and only take some consideration at the possibility of fighting in the region, mostly out of a defensive nature. Syria did not join the war for the first 4 days, however being fed false intel reports from Egypt about a stunning victory against the Israelis, and reports from Egypt saying that they were about to attack on ground at Tel Aviv, soon convinced the Syrians of their decision to enter the war. Syrian artillery began shelling the northern Israel, with 12 jets attacking settlements in Galilee. In addition, 2 Lebanese Hawker hunters joined in on the strikes. The Israeli Air Force responded to this by rapidly shooting down 3 Syrian and 1 Lebanese jets. In another case of laying down a hammer strike in response to what is essentially a pinprick by the Syrians, Israeli planes assaulted Syrian airfields, destroying 32 MiG-21s, 23 MiG-15s and 17s, along with 2 IL-28s. The surviving Syrian airplanes retreated to distant bases in the north and took no role. Syria was now acutely aware that the Egyptians had not exactly been telling the truth in those earlier reports. On the 6th of June, a very minor Syrian force advanced on the water plants at Tal Dan, and they were repulsed with significant losses. Again, the Israeli Air Force dominated the front by breaking up Syrian reserves and assaults, with a post-war Syrian report saying they simply could not move or operate under the air assault. Syria again attempted to keep up the bombardment in Galilee. Interestingly, they used dug-in Panzer IV tanks for this purpose. However, it was not greatly effective. On the morning of the 9th, Israeli jets upped the tempo of assault using captured Egyptian rockets. The Israeli airstrikes had effectively exhausted Israel's supply of ammunition, and they were using captured ammunition, which is quite interesting. About 2 hours later, the 8th Armored advanced into the Golan Heights, taking significant casualties as the Syrians put up significant resistance. The Israeli attack pressed on, and it continued into the 10th of June, with the city of Quneitra falling. The radio report stating that the city had fallen was actually released by the Syrians before the city fell, because they wanted, in what is described as an attempt to force their own military to stand down, because they knew it was a losing battle. That report shattered the remaining Syrian morale, and they retreated from the Golan area. By the end of the 10th of June, it was all over, and a ceasefire was signed. Israel had taken the Gaza Strip, Sinai, West Bank, and Golan Heights, and the war was effectively over 6 days after it began. The end of the war saw 983 Israelis dead, 4,517 wounded, an astonishingly low amount considering the brutality of the fighting. Arab casualties are estimated to be between 9,800 and 15,000. The key to Israel's success, outnumbered and outgunned and surrounded, was the Air Force. The power of air supremacy in this war was what won the day for the Israelis without a doubt. Now, allegedly, some pretty horrific war crimes occurred during this war, which, given the location of the conflict, I am not going to speak about for obvious reasons. I don't want to deal with my comment section if I do. During the war, both sides would claim the other had help from the great powers, Israel from America and the UK and France, and the Arabs from the Soviet Union. While there is likely some truth to it given the ideological struggle at the time, and there are certain instances of possible forces from each country being in the conflict, it wasn't anything big enough to change the outcome of the war in terms of deployment and hard factor support. In all likelihood, information was the biggest factor that both sides could provide, and the information that was likely shared openly to the Israelis and Arabs from their respective allies would have been crucial to the fighting, but the fighting was not undertaken by Americans or Soviets on any notable scale at least. You get these kind of accusations in most wars, to be honest. I mean, the combatant crowd still thinks Russia is fighting NATO in Ukraine, for example, and it's going to continue as a rumour. The truly sad part is, though, this war just triggered the 1973 Yom Kippur War, not even 6 years later. As we all know, the region still remains in conflict today, and it is an unlikely conflict to be resolved in our lifetimes. All we can hope is that when the conflict resolution does come, it doesn't cost as many lives as I'm afraid it will.